Hi, everyone. So welcome to this second session of the Perspectivism of Platforms. Today's session is titled Users and Interfaces, Animals and Spirits. I'd like to thank Lukáš for accepting my invitation to participate as a special guest in the session. This presentation, just like last time, it's based on the text of the talk that served as the basis for this workshop, but it's very cut down, and then I added a lot of new material and reflections that I wanted to keep developing with you guys here. So in the last session, we discussed platforms and platforming, and especially how platforms can be understood as producing two kinds of level differences. Differences in plane of agency and differences in the mode and degree of visibility. So that stemmed from my previous research and from a combination of references, including speculative realism in a broad sense, Deleuzean assemblage theory, Foucault legal theory, particularly Hans Kelsen and Carl Schmitt, platform studies, algorithmic governance studies, and so on. In this session, we're going to try to rework what we were discussing about platforms through cosmological perspectivism, right? In last week, we also already entered in the discussion, as was maybe inevitable, into the theme of this week's session, which is the actual point of the whole workshop, the interface between platformnomics and the concepts of cosmological perspectivism, as well as like the sort of background question that we were discussing about whether there is or not a kind of meta-perspectival orientation of differences of scale. So the readings for this session were sections 3, 4, and 5 of my Platforming and Perspectivism talk. Chapter 8, titled Cosmologies, Perspectivism of Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's book, The Relative Native. And chapter 7, titled Image and Skin of Davi Kopenawa and Bruce Albert's The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman. But well, let's get started, right? I would like to start discussing agency, perspective, and the relation between that and the notion of the body in perspectivism. So, and I'm going to be closer to the texts than I was in my talk, right? So Viveiros de Castro defines perspectivism, and I quote, as the conception common to many peoples of the American continent, according to which the world is inhabited by different sorts of subjects or persons, human and non-human, which apprehend reality from different points of view. So you have subjects or people who may be human or not. Okay, we have a differentiation between the categories of people and human, as we have, non-human people. So in perspectivism, everyone or everybody is people, right? But this status of a subject or person is itself always relative to a certain perspective. Humans are people to humans, jaguars are people to jaguars, but jaguars are normally jaguars to humans, and humans aren't humans to jaguars either. They might appear as prey animals, such as peccaries, or in different conditions, they may appear as predator animals or even as spirits. Personhood or perspectivity, in Viveiro's words, that is the capacity to occupy a point of view, is a question of degree and of context. Those are his words. You may become more or less of a person depending on the context, not simply your context, but the context in which the encounter between your perspective and someone else's happens. So to be a person in perspectivism is to have a perspective and to occupy the position of an agent. Needless to say, this is what the whole discussion in last session about differences of agency and differences of visibility was sort of designed to lead to. Perspectivism seems to be, in some sense, about the distribution of relative positions or degrees of agency and of visibility. Viveiros emphasizes that Amerindian terms for people usually operate as a pronoun rather than a name. They indicate a position of agency rather than an essence or a substance. The position of person is occupied as long as someone is capable to gain the position of an agent in some perspectival relation. Some non-human beings may, in fact, I quote Viveiros, have powers of agency far superior than humans, and in this sense, they can be more persons than humans. A similar relativity affects visibility, the distribution of appearing ases and seeing ases depends on the negotiation of perspectives. And this is very important. Perspectives are a function of bodies, not of souls or spirits. Therefore, differences in perspective follow from somatic differences, bodily differences, not spiritual differences. Animals see different things than we do the same way. You know, like this might not be very clear, like this is my translation, because this part is actually present in a Portuguese version of this essay. You know, animals see different things than we do the same way we do. So for example, the jaguar sees blood as beer. So the jaguar has the beer, it sees something the same way we see it as beer, but the thing that it sees is different, right? And that is the case, not because their souls are different from ours, but because their bodies are different. So the perspectivist notion of body, which is relevant here, it's important to clarify that it's not a physiological or an anatomic notion of body. In these anatomic or physiological terms, for perspectivists, everyone has a similar human body. The relevant somatic difference relates rather to, I quote, the affects, affections, and capacities which singularize each type of body. What does it eat? How does it move? How does it communicate? Is it gregarious or solitary? And so on. A body, I continue to quote, is a set of manners or modes of being which constitute a habitus between the formal subjectivity of souls and the material substantiality of organisms, there's this central plane, which is the body, as a stream of affections and capacities, and which is the origin of perspectives. So he finishes by saying that perspectivism is a corporeal mannerism. This notion of the body is what in last session's discussion I connected to Deleuze's treatment of the Kantian schema when he argues that lions are Kantian, which will finally result in the concept of the diagram. For Deleuze, the schema or the diagram of the lion is not the definition of the lion being a big animal, a mammal with a mane, growling, etc. Rather, I quote Deleuze, it's the spatiotemporal rhythms, spatiotemporal mannerisms, an animal's territory and an animal's domain with its paths, the traces that it leaves in its domain, the times that it uses a particular path, and so on. The lion is Kantian, Deleuze says, all animals are Kantian. I continue to quote Deleuze. What is the schema of the spider? The schema of the spider is the web. Deleuze makes the schema, which is how concepts are correlated to intuitions in the transcendental problematic, into a spatio-temporal dynamism, which is characteristically animal, not human. It's bodily, but not anatomical. So yeah, so the schema of the lion is this, or of any animal, is this series of rhythms and mannerisms. This seems like an exteriorization or an immanentization, depending on your reference point, of the transcendental. So given this, I wonder if Viveiros had this passage in mind when he came up with this particular way to translate the perspectivist concept of the body. I mean, when he says that it's a mannerism, he uses the same expression that Deleuze is using, and he's also describing a very similar kind of animal ethogram as the body, you know. So what perspectivism has as the body seems to be very close to this description of the lion's transcendental schema, or what Deleuze calls also a rule of production, even though the word rule here is used in a kind of particular sense. So I wonder if Viveiros had this in mind when he used this description as a way to translate the perspectivist conception of the body, and how we might connect that to the definition of the Shaum as a master of cosmic schematism, which Viveiros quotes from Gell, or Gell, I don't know how you say his name. I also wonder here if Lukáš would think we could call this, this diagrammatic schema as a sort of cosmogram, if you could maybe approach that to the notion of a cosmogram, in the sense of a diagram which governs the continuous production and maintenance of a world, and also of a certain spatiality, certain topology. And I wonder if we may call it, a nomos, or a sort of nomics. And finally, also, I think that when Deleuze picks the lion, he might be playing, and I'm thinking here of JP, I don't know if he's coming today, but This is something that we were discussing last time, right? I wonder if when Deleuze picks the lion from all animals, if he might be playing with Wittgenstein's notion of form of life, how, you know, even if the lion spoke the same language as us, we couldn't understand him because we don't share the same form of life. Viveiros says that in the Jaguar's dictionary, you know, the word beer has the same definition it has in our dictionary, but Jaguars use it to refer to a different thing, namely blood. So this is why we don't understand Jaguars, not because they have a different language or even a different world, but because they have a different form of life, and in the perspectivist sense, a different body. So to recapitulate, you know, we saw that in perspectivism, we have all kinds of differences of agency and visibility, which are expressed in perspectival differences. And now we see that those differences are functions of an encounter between two or more, maybe, bodies considered as ethnograms, rhythms, mannerisms, forms of life, rules of production. Whether someone will appear as a person, an animal, or a spirit to someone else, thus depends not just on their own body or life form, but on how different bodies, different cosmograms, forms of life meet and establish a dynamical interaction. So how does this play out in the platform context we sketched out last week? The idea for this whole exercise comes from some pretty simple, straightforward, even kind of naive parallels, which I developed a bit in the platforming and perspectivism talk. I'm going to sketch them out here quite quickly. First, when it comes to subjects, persons, or agents, the multi-scalar environment of platforms produces multiple different levels which users might occupy as agents. Thus, user content, the user content in question in each case might correspond to individuals or groups of biological humans, in which case differences of plane of agency might be created within the human species. Or in other contexts, the user content may be non-human, especially if we consider contemporary phenomena such as the Internet of Things, self-driving cars, different types or levels of artificial intelligence, algorithmic governance agencies, and even animal users, as we've seen with the device-equipped polar bear in the current video that was a reading for last session. In a perspectivist framework, all of those different kinds of users might appear as people to themselves and to similar users, perhaps. And then there is appearing as an animal. What are like the consequences, or what is it that constitutes to appear as an animal? I would say that in normal conditions, animals matter to humans or to us in terms of their materiality, their energy and substance. On the one hand, we may feed on their bodies or use their force for our own ends, or extract their skins, feathers, teeth, horns. Or on the other hand, in their own physical force and speed and so on, they may constitute a threat of predation for us, in which case it is our bodies that might serve as a source of substance and energy for them. So in this sense, I suspect that we biological humans might appear to certain platform agencies or certain types of users as animals in this sense, especially as prey animals, that is, as bodies which are available to be consumed in their matter. You know, like as platform entities constitute, you know, superior capabilities for agency and intelligence. The type of intelligence that we present in our level of agency may become so different and of so little relevance that we may start to appear to them as animals. Just think about, for example, in this ethnography that's mentioned by Viveiros, from the point of view of the sun and the moon, humans might appear as monkeys, for example. And then thirdly, there's appearing or disappearing as spirits. Viveiros defines spirits, I quote, as entities of Amerindian worlds that do not have a stable, normally visible bodily form, evincing in a superlative manner the metamorphic capacity proper to all persons. Spirits are, in a sense, more than human persons or meta-persons. So it's neither the case that spirits aren't people or that they don't have bodies. They have bodies of a type that's very different from our own, which exist in densities, scales, or levels that are so different from ours, that are too different from ours for us to either comprehend their actions as such or to perceive them with our intuition. So it would seem that to relate to a spirit is to establish a relation with an agent that is on another level of abstraction different from our own. To quote Viveiros, the notion of animal spirit masters, such as mothers of the game, master of the white-lipped peccaries, and so on, is widely spread throughout the American continent. Those spirit masters, clearly endowed with a type of intentionality-based agency analogous to that of humans, function as hypostases of the animal species with which they are associated, thereby creating an intersubjective field for human-animal relations, even where empirical animals are not considered as agents or not spiritualized. So bringing this to our digital platform environment, we may speculate that a platform entity may appear as a spirit, for instance, in the sense of existing and acting on a level of abstraction which can't be phenomenologically experienced by us, depending on what kind of body corresponds to this us. We may think, for example, of an algorithmic governance agency whose technical implementation is distributed across servers and informational networks across different continents, and whose social implementation encompasses entire populations. And as those platforms platform different users differently, users may appear as spirits in relation to last platform users. In his version of the metaverse, for example, Zuckerberg might be capable of seeing us very transparently, while he may be a sort of invisible abstract entity that appears to us only when and how he decides to. I think in this sense that the differences of agency and of appearing that we find in perspectivism would seem to imply scale or level differences, which, as we discussed, seems to conflict, this seems to conflict with the common association of the ontological term in anthropology with so-called flat ontologies, though I don't remember Viveiros ever using a similar term to that. The top definition that I got on Google for flat ontology is as follows: a model for reality that says that all objects have the same degree of beingness as any other object. No object is more a subject than any other. In this sense, Viveiros' reconstruction of perspectivism is not, I think, a flat ontology, since we have just seen him define Amerindian spirits as having a relatively greater degree of subjectness than us. Then I got also a definition from Levi Bryant, in which I quote, "Flat ontology rejects any ontology of transcendence or presence that privileges one sort of entity as the origin of all others and as fully present to itself." And it signifies, flat ontology signifies that the world or the universe, the world with a capital the, maybe like he's actually italicizing the world or the universe doesn't exist. This, I think, seems far more compatible, though I don't see why to call this flat, an image that, as I emphasized last week, seems to arbitrarily privilege this bidimensional plane over other possible topologies. Like, why a plane? Why not a dot, a line, a cube, and so on? So flat ontology, as cosmopolitically linked to what Bryant calls a democracy of objects, seems to be an ontology which is in principle non-hierarchical. All beings are, in the sense, all beings, are, they have their being, they are, or they exist in the same sense and in the same degree. We might want to call this ontological liberal democracy. What Viveiros de Castro proposes explicitly, for example, in his essay on models and examples, is instead an ontological anarchism. The difference, I would argue, is that he isn't affirming that ontology is non-hierarchical or flat. In principle, he's affirming a cosmological, or rather a cosmopolitical commitment to de-hierarchizing or flattening ontology. I believe this is quite linked to the influence of Pierre Clastres' Societies Against the State. And perhaps in our context, we may speak of peoples or forms of life against platforming. Is this sound any better? Well, this is, I think, a far more subtle and interesting position, though I'm not sure I agree with it. And by this, I mean that I'm not sure that I think that the differentiation of levels is inherently bad it's inherently a politically bad thing. In any case, what I would like to propose in this respect, and here we are touching on that broadest metaphysical and cosmopolitical question, which has already been appearing since last week. I'd like to propose to avoid an alternative between these following two positions. So one position would be flat ontology. There are no real differences of level. And the opposite position would be what we might call a strong mononaturalism. There are real differences of level, and therefore there must be a true general orientation of level differences, which the scientific image would model. This is something that appeared a lot in our interview with Lukáš and also with Benjamin Braddon in that Sheltering Places episode that we had a couple months ago. So in relation to those two positions, I would like to propose a third position compatible, I think, with this sort of platform perspectivism that's appearing from our experiment here. And in this position, there are differences of level or of plane of abstraction or scale or whatever, which are real, but they are not perspective independent as such. They only acquire a definite orientation, which allows us to identify, higher and lower scales in relation to one another in the concrete encounter between different bodies/perspectives. So the differences of level are real, so much that in many cases, the fact that we wish that it would disappear does nothing to prevent them from affecting us, just like a prey is powerless in relation to a predator. But those differences are produced as such in nomic operations, which as such are political. They don't have to do first and foremost with truth and falsehood, but rather with differences of force, strategies, diagrams of power. Truth is important too, of course, but I think the question of truth sort of comes afterwards. In Amerindian perspectivism, the general paradigm for all of this is hunting, and the paradigmatic setting in which perspectives are negotiated is the forest encounter. In the text from my talk, I try to unpack this by contrasting the forest and the prison. So we may think of the panoptic diagram from Foucault, and by the way, the sense in which the panopticon has or is a diagram is precisely the same sense in which the lion has its diagram, or in which the body may be considered as a diagram, which is the solution or the delusion. And according to Deleuze, also the Foucauldian, in Deleuze's reading of Foucault, the Foucauldian treatment of the transcendental problem of the schematism, So it's sort of, in Deleuze's thought, it starts with this discussion of Kant, and then there's the works about Foucault and also Francis Bacon and A Thousand Plateaus, and that's sort of where this concept of the diagram starts to appear from. One of the big paradigmatic appearances of the diagram is the panopticon. So if the panoptic diagram, that's this abstract set of dynamical relations, which is then reproduced in prisons and schools and factories and barracks and so on, while this sort of diagram operates through architecture, the disciplining of bodies, the distribution of light, etc., to stabilize somatic and perspectival differences, we may think of the forest as a non-disciplined environment. And then it appears as the setting in which all of those parameters of, embodiment and visibility may vary wildly, and then from there, I suggested that we should ask ourselves whether contemporary platformization is more like a prison or more like forest. And at this point, I'm reminded also of Bogna Koinor's video essay, The Dark Forest Theory of the Internet, which I posted on the event page. I don't know if any of you got to seeing it. I know that Lukáš was in an event with her, I think yesterday. I think you know her well, or at least she said she knew you. I don't know, when I commented on like this correlation. And I also saw, I was rereading the last part of Lukáš's book on cosmograms, and there was also a part where this comparison between the forest and the city, and this reappearance of the forest as a sort of a paradigm was also present in Bogna's video essay. There's like this discussion about how in this kind of dark forest environment, you might want to regulate your conditions of visibility. You might want to disappear, to not emit, this perceptible signs, and to maybe to act and to appear only in a very strategic way. I think it communicates a lot with this sort of perspectivist paradigm in which the hunting and the prey-predator situation sort of serves as a general way to negotiate, cosmopolitical relations in this different environment. So in short, to me, if the platform milieu today is anything like a dark forest, that is to say that there is no stabilized orientation of the topological relation between different platforms, even though they function by producing differences of level. There's no final negotiation of their relative positions within a same coherent spatiality or topology. Their level differences are not as much a final reality as a gnomic project or a cosmonomic project. This project, as we discussed last time, is effectuated through algorithmic governance, at least paradigmatically at this point, through algorithmic governance, which is at once a cognitive and a governmental activity. And precisely in this sense, it's a synthetic process. This recursive process of algorithmic governance is what we might consider as the diagram or the schema or the rule of production of any given platform, in the same sense as the lion had its diagram and the prison had its diagram, though it's of a different sort. It's the platform's body in the perspectivist sense, its form of life, or its rule of production, its cosmogram. So this is why, even though speaking of an ontology of platforms might seem just as arbitrary as speaking of a flat ontology, in a sense, that you're presupposing this flat structure of the platform. I would argue that it's quite different, and this is because we are speaking here of platforms as nomic devices, and this is not to say that reality is just made of platforms. It's to conceptualize nomic processes which work to produce this particular topology. Platforms are, in this sense, ontological anti-anarchists and ontological hierarchizers. They're agents that try to produce and maintain this particular structure, this particular spatialized structure of worlds and their relations. And finally, in the text from my talk, I finished by briefly touching on the theme of shamanism. And in this context of general cosmopolitical negotiation of all kinds of level differences, shamans are the professionals of heuristics or of navigation. Shamanism is the practice of navigating differences of level through somatic metamorphosis, not so much a transformation as a transubstantiation. I discussed there how in traditional forms of shamanism, there are various bodily technologies which are used to operate those transitions, such as taking certain substances or chanting or dancing or, any kind of ritual. There are also shamanistic tools that serve as a dispositive to acquire a different perspective. There's a point where Viveiros quotes a passage where a shaman is explaining how they use a rope as their shamanic tool, and they use the rope because in order to cure the other person who they are trying to cure, they can't do anything as a person, but as a rope. If they become a rope and they imagine the other person also as a rope with a knot, then as a rope they might be able to untie that knot. So there's all kinds of technologies involved in this shamanistic practice, and I suspect that the same might apply to the field of platforms. And then we might think of a techno-shamanism, which is really, just shamanism, since it has always been technological or cosmotechnical to begin with. So in this platform environment, our degrees of agency and visibility are a function of our bodies, and our bodies as users are a distributed network of various human and non-human entities of various types on various scales and levels. In this context, any alteration in any of those elements is already somatic and therefore perspectival alteration, and as such, we can think of it as a form of shamanism. So you could think, for example, that practices of hacking could be understood in this sense as forms of shamanism, in the sense that you have, like in the computational platform, you have stratification of various levels from the hardware to different software levels, the operating system, and then languages of different degrees of abstraction, which are built on others until you get to applications that are supposed to constrain while affording the available actions for a user. So if you're a normal user, the platform is giving you in advance what is the level of abstraction that you're supposed to operate in. The rest, what's below that, is already stratified, and you can't just restructure the field of possibilities that is immediately available for you. And that is on the basis of all of the functions that are constructing this are very well formed and very well finalized. And in a sense, we can think of what a hacker does as operating in the informal interstices that are left open of this formalization to actually access different layers which were supposed to be fully structured and actually restructure the conditions for their own action. And in order to do that, they have to change the configurations of their user body. And I'm emphasizing that the user's body is not simply the human body, like the last time we were discussing this distinction between the user form and the user content. Like the user, since it has a software dimension in its very constitution, it also has a part of its implementation, which is implemented on the technological computational platform. So I'm considering alterations in this platform also as alterations in the body of the user, which then transform its capabilities of action, the relation between the constraints and the freedoms that are afforded to it. So there's this practice where you're going to sort of descend from a formalized level of the platform into a diagrammatic, strategic, less formal, more informal level in order to produce a different formalization, which is going to change what are the affordances that are available to you. Okay. And we could then understand in this sense that, quote, that shamans are masters of cosmic schematism. They intervene in the very diagram of the world that they are navigating at the level of the schema, the cosmogram, the form of life, the rule of production, that is at the level of the body. There would still be much to develop here about how in perspectivism, shamanism is connected to hunting, how hunting is connected to war, and how all of this it relates to what Viveiros de Castro has termed virtual kinship, especially if the most general ontological politics or nomics that I've sketched out here is Schmittian in a very fundamental sense. I think that Amerindian perspectivism points to a crucial difference because of the concept of the immanence of the enemy. There would be no solipsism in this sense in perspectivism as opposed to modern relativism, because there is no rigid border or separation between our world or our ontology and their world or their ontology. We and our world are constructed through others, even if the other is an enemy. So even if the mode of interrelation of worlds is often and perhaps fundamentally that of war and of predation, this doesn't exclude the immanence of every world to every other world, and therefore their reciprocal reciprocal negotiability and navigability. So this is a way, I guess, to respond to the whole problematic about how is it that perspectivism can allow us to navigate those differences of level as something which is not simply a subjective projection, as something which is real or external in a way, without either depending on the existence, as JP was arguing, of a general meta perspective that orients the relation between all different modes of platforming, and without, on the other hand, just producing a sort of bad version of relativism in which there is no real external grasp of any common reality between perspectives, like any perspective is just like arbitrarily creating an external world. I think the difference here between a conception of an epistemological perspectivism and an ontological perspectivism is important, because if you have an epistemological perspectivism, you're still operating on the separation of subject and object. And then the subject is going to simply be arbitrarily projecting their framework to construct reality. While in this ontological perspectivism, you have to assume, as a kind of a metaphysical axiom, that reality is composed of those perspectives, that reality is perspectival as such. And so you kind of navigate reality by transitioning between perspectives. Well, we can go on continuing that in the discussion. Just before finishing this initial presentation, last time Adam Klein asked what was the purpose of this exercise, and I think that's a very important question, and I gave him an answer which I think is not exactly wrong, but I think it's insufficient, so I wanted to elaborate a bit more on that. I basically said that I'm drawing from indigenous Amerindian concepts because I'm interested in philosophy or in thought, and that to mobilize those concepts is a philosophical choice like any other. You know, I might have picked to study platforms through Hegel or through Heidegger or through Brandom, and I have, as you've seen the last session, studied them through Schmidt or through Deleuze, etc. And now I'm interested in studying them through Amerindian perspectivism. And I say this because I think it's important not to be condescending in relation to extra modern forms of thought. And there are different, sometimes opposite ways in which you can be condescending about them. One way, of course, is to think that they don't really deserve to be studied, and that whoever does study them is just trying to earn, you know, points somehow. But another way to be condescending about them, I think, is to treat them as some kind of magical solution to all problems caused by the West, or like they're purer, truer, more ethical forms of thought, or that by studying them, you're doing some kind of favor to indigenous people or to our planet. And I think, you know, one way to avoid that is to put cosmologies sort of on the same level as other conceptual frameworks, which are also cosmologies in their own way. And at the same time, of course, there is a cosmopolitical dimension to such a choice as to any other philosophical choice. There is an affirmation of the diversity of worlds. And more than that, there's a sort of wager in the notion, which is very debatable, of course, that even if you don't belong to the peoples who have created and maintain those forms of thought, that it's still better to study them than not to. This is all very tense, because those are real people who not only aren't here discussing this with us, but who are suffering a very violent process, not only of the destruction of their traditional form of life and environment, but of their very biological life. It's, in fact, no exaggeration in this case to speak of ongoing genocide. So I don't think it's either inherently bad or inherently good to study indigenous cosmologies. And I think it's very problematic in the true sense of the word, and dangerous. You know, to say that perspectivism is a powerful form of thought of our own time and for possible futures, and that it's not confined to a local or traditional setting, that it can abstract itself and navigate all layers and dimensions of planetary scale technology, is on one hand to point to those people's contemporary importance and to the injustice of their condition, but it also presents us with the very real risk that their thought could be abstracted and mobilized to deal with all kinds of problems, while the people who develop them are exterminated. And I think that all I can say in this respect is that if we are moved by the intellectual and cosmopolitical force of perspectivist thought, shame, if nothing else, should mobilize us to not only think about this, but to act in relation to this situation, right? I just thought it would be important to point this out. But well, I think this is enough for the initial presentation. Sorry if it wasn't very structured, but now I would like to hear first from Lukáš. I think initially I thought that the first session was more obviously related to JP's work than this one was to your work, but then now I was, as I said, taking a new look at your book on comparative planetology, and I actually found a lot of common intersections. So I'm very curious about what your take is going to be on all of this, and then we can move directly to the general discussion.
Okay, Zed, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I was paying attention to what you're talking, and I'm especially very happy for that last remark that you did about what is the value in studying Amerindian perspectivism in relation to, let's say, platform ontologies, because that was actually my struggle as well. Back in 2017, I decided not to finish an essay which was titled Platform Perspectivism, because I realized that actually I couldn't negotiate any meaningful subjective position to Amerindian perspectivism without risking some kind of, let's call it epistemic violence. So basically my strategy was to back up back then. And the reason why I had that idea of writing that essay in mind was that the first time I was reading The Stack by Benjamin Bratton, I was reading it alongside Viveiros de Castro's Cannibal Metaphysics. It wasn't a an intentional choice. It was simply an accident that happened in sort of like how my reading list composed back then. And I've realized that at some points, like those alignments, I found some very surprising alignments back then, especially when it comes to how to think about perspectivism as a vocabulary through which we can express certain properties of platform ontologies, especially when it comes to properties of addressability and user positions. So I guess this is something that I would like to contribute to your stream of thought now, to think about ontology as a question of addressability and culture, especially in this kind of Amerindian vocabulary, where culture has a very different meaning from the culture in the, let's say, the modern Western constitution set in the Laturian manner. So thinking about culture as a space of addressability in this sense. It starts with a question: who belongs to platform polis, or who belongs to cloud polis, to the community of users, in other words. And that immediately leads to another question, which is, what is the mode of belonging, or how do things belong in the given platform community? So we're kind of here in a search of some social link, or some kind of social ontology, but the exact modality of that sociality that we are going to tackle is not somehow decided in advance. It can be biological circulation or discursive behavior. Both can be legitimate ways of how to craft social links. And in that way, that it kind of resembles certain aspects of actor network theory by Latour, where also sociality is an emergent relationship of links or relations that have other than social ontological modality. And I think that's kind of interesting way how to think also about platform ontology and addressability as something that is an emergent property, or something that can actually be used to simulate different kinds of exchanges, communications, transactions, links. I'm going to return that in the moment, especially to the notion of exchange. But for now, I guess one of the moments that I really liked when I was reading Stack was this definition of user triumvirate that Ben Bratton defines as a definition of user based on what a user has, what user is, or what user does. These are like three aspects that are sufficient to define any user according to him. And when we invite here this notion of perspective, then it is at first very clear that perspective as user identity is not the same as perspective as some kind of subjective opinion, which follows from perspective being a function of body in Amerindian perspectivism. That's something that you have explained sufficiently and nicely in your exposition. And so this also, and I think this is just a footnote basically to make, that this is not about, or what we are talking here about is not a relativism of incommensurable epistemic systems. We're talking rather about some kind of ontological relativism, which is based on what is the criterion of some kind of addressability. And basically then this criteria of addressability will differentiate between ontologies, or that will be the category that is a principle according to which we can differentiate platform ontologies. And the point I want to make based on these remarks is that in perspectivism, culture or soul is a principle of generic communality, while body is a principle of individuation. So the ontological bedrock is shared culture that exists in multiple manifestations that are contingent on the relations between bodies, but they repeat the grand generic scheme, always from a specific point of view. So this is something that to me resembles the mode of sociality in platform polis or cloud polis, where embodiment becomes vector of relationality, so to speak. And to make it clear, or to clarify it through the reference to Viveiros de Castro's own thinking about perspectivism, I was going back to some of the remarks he made in Cannibal Metaphysics. And for example, at page 50, he actually has this quite famous citation from Levi-Strauss, which goes like this. In the Greater Antilles, some years after the discovery of America, while the Spaniards sent out investigating commissions to ascertain whether or not the natives had a soul, the latter were engaged in the drowning of white prisoners in order to verify, through prolonged watching, whether or not their corpses were subject to putrefaction. And 5 pages later, Viveiros de Castro also explains this sort of experiments by pointing at how various ethnographers have noted, unfortunately too often only in passing, that virtually all people of the New World, quote unquote, the New World, of course, share a conception of the world as composed of a multiplicity of points of view. Every existent is the center of intentionality apprehending other existence according to their respective characteristics and powers. The presuppositions and consequences of this idea are nevertheless irreducible to the current concept of relativism that they would at first glance seem to evoke. And I think this is an important remark that Viveiros de Castro is going to make now. They are, in fact, instead arranged on a plane which is orthogonal to the opposition between relativism and universalism. And now, if we replace, and this is the end of the quote, so now a bit of interpretation. I guess that now if we replace soul with space of address, then you get a very secular platform ontology working on the exactly same principle as Amerindian perspectivism. Some kind of perspectivism which is very similar actually to ontology of monads, for example, in Leibniz. And Viveiros de Castro at some point even says that we can think about perspectives as monadological persons. And that brings, I mean, that's the moment where I started to falling down to the rabbit hole of references to other thinkers that somehow related body to a certain perspectival position. First of those philosophers is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, for who phenomenal body is an arc of experience, or the ultimate arc of experience. And it's important to understand that it is not just a body as some kind of corporeal entity, but the body for Merleau-Ponty is also a phenomenological invariant. Similarly, like for example, in Metzinger, we have also some kind of phenomenal self-model that is sort of at certain points equivocal to the corporeality of the given body. Which brings me then to the notion that you asked about at the very beginning, and that was that notion of ethogram, where the ethogram can be thought of as some diagram that, let's say, brings to the fore the history of the interactions of the given individual entity with its environment. Which leads then to perhaps interpreting the body as an accumulation of habits that have some material consequences. I guess it's important to understand how twisted in a certain way from the position of Western philosopher is the notion of corporeality and the body in Amerindian perspectivism, because it actually uses body as a principle of individuation, which is very different than the standard metaphysical outlook, where individuation happens through possessing, for example, an individual soul or individual personality or some kind of psychological profile that differentiates you from other entities called humans in this context. And that's the moment where I guess it's also good to bring into discussion the concept of shamanism that we were talking about, but again in a way that I don't think that shamanism in this respect, when we are talking about it in the context of platform ontologies, is really the same thing as, for example, happens when we enter a specific context of indigenous populations of South America. But I guess like there is something interesting in this general principle that communication with other species or other entities can happen through some kind of transformation, because in the shamanistic outlook, the transformation itself is a kind of communication, as also Eduardo Kohn shows in his How Forest Thinks book, which is an idea that I find very vital in opposing some standard, let's say, cosmopolitical opinions that dominate also Western thinking today, like those by Bruno Latour, where Latour talks, for example, about parliament of things as some tool through which we can hypothetically communicate or negotiate with other entities by means of actually, I think that Latour brings here like a very liberal idea of parliament into discussion, where basically all the entities are somehow forced to speak the same language in this kind of like shared or common ground of the parliament of things. And that's the moment where actually language becomes something that everyone needs to somehow align with or find some kind of common denominator in the way how discursively different entities in that parliament, in that hypothetical parliament of things behave. While in the shamanistic outlook, what is interesting is actually that you adopt the linguistic behavior, the perspective, the communication, the habits of communications that are specific to the entity you want to communicate with. So there is this element of always somehow learning to behave differently according to who you communicate with. And this transformative aspect is really interesting because actually it kind of like shakes the ground of some individualistic, liberal understanding of political subjectivity that I guess is still on the cosmological background also of Latour's idea of the parliament of things, or parliament of things, I'm sorry. And that brings me to the last remark that I want to make, and that is about an advantage of shamanism being actually a matrix through which we can think about some kind of position of interspecies diplomats. This advantage is that there is no need to construct common world in a strong sense in a shamanistic outlook, in this kind of like finding of common denominators of highest order that would interpret every action. Because, in this kind of outlook that, for example, Latour and other thinkers present, actions are interpreted locally, while identities are interpreted globally. While in, some kind of, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This is actually something that I wanted to say the other way around, because it's a kind of complex to explain. But basically, the idea is that in mononaturalism, which is basically the kind of modern constitution outlook or modern constitution ontology, in mononaturalism, actions are interpreted globally by some global rules and identities locally. It means that identity is something that is based on belonging to some kind of specific situated perspective. And your actions are basically predefined by a set of, let's say, different exchanges or communicative actions that can happen in the world based on some general physical or other laws. And in the multinaturalist world, it works differently because basically your actions are defined each time differently, or the set of actions that you can do is interpreted differently, and it's conditioned by who you are trying to make a communicative action or any some other kind of exchange with. So basically, this is the idea where what we privilege is some generic space in which we first distribute identities. And these identities basically are somehow predefining set of rules according to which you can communicate with them. But there is no arbiter of the global outlook in this way. So I guess like this is a sort of way how I would try to interpret certain aspect of perspectivism in relation to platform ontologies, leading to some idea of generic universality of the lowest common denominator opposed to the universality of the highest common denominator, which is basically something that is necessitated by the way how the duality of mononaturalism and multiculturalism is sort of set in the modern constitution that so many other thinkers, including Viveiros de Castro, including Latour, including people like Felipe Descolat, so many authors that actually quite nicely attack and criticize this kind of like modern ontological outlook. I'm sorry that it's a bit like a whirl of references and remarks, but the basic idea or the basic takeaway from what I'm trying to say, I guess, is really that there is a certain analogy to make between perspectivism and platform ontologies in the way how they both establish a vocabulary through which we can think about some generic space of addressability. And I think it's something really useful also in the moment when we, for example, face certain problematics related to ecological crisis today, where again, I guess the problem is to what extent we as humans, we as species, we as individuals can or cannot belong to some larger, more than human community and negotiate our position within such a kind of community. So I guess that's it for the beginning of the conversation with you, Zach.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that was incredible. I'm, of course, there's like a lot there that could be unpacked. I don't want to make like a big response right now, because I want also to let people start participating. Then I can like continue to bring back the stuff that I'm taking notes. Like I took a bunch of notes here, but I guess the main thing that I would like to say from your response is about this condition of, you know, what are the conditions of our relation to this form of addressing this problem, because this is something that is very present in Viveiro's own work as an anthropologist. And then when we bring it into, you know, philosophy or political philosophy, or in my case, you know, legal theory, or what I call nomics, which is kind of an expansion of legal theory, it's still present there, and it has to be also sort of restructured, because it's not exactly an anthropological procedure anymore, though like his own anthropological procedure is quite mixed with this philosophical, cosmological, even like sort of shamanistic relation to the other. And one thing he says about this, which I think is important, and I even I posted like a piece of text on Twitter earlier that I was reading it, because I was going back to his text about methodology, precisely thinking about this. And one thing he says is that when you're trying to reconstruct these cosmologies, it's not so much a question of explicitating the other's world, but sort of multiplying your own world or your own concepts, trying to, you know, emit a multiplicity of concepts, and then trying to force this the potentialities, the implicit potentialities of the other, let that force you to think something that you wouldn't be capable of thinking. I'm saying this because you mentioned, you know, how we can't simply think that we are going to be, you know, shamans in relation to platforms, or that platforms are like a forest, as if we were Amerindians, because we're not. Like, that's the whole problem. We don't share that form of life, so we can't simply from a different form of life assume that we can take those conceptual apparatuses and copy paste them, you know. But at the same time, in as much as our form of life starts to present certain aspects that might reverberate, let's say, with some of the problems that exist in that world. For example, in as much as the internet starts to look somehow like a dark forest, then we might start to be able, by multiplying our own references and concepts and keeping this correlation active with this other form of life, then we might start to reconstruct something which is different, but which is sort of communicating with that in this way, you know, by multiplication and selection. And I especially like that caught my attention because like last time and for a while, like in discussion with JP and with like Cássia and all of the neo-rationalist inspired people, you know, there's this strong Brandomian element which is related to the model of making it explicit. And then there's this passage where Viveiros is commenting on Deleuze, and he's talking precisely about leaving it implicit. He's saying, you know, you don't have to make explicit what the native is saying or thinking. You have to keep it implicit, keep it as a sort of virtuality, and then you start to explicitate with your own conceptual apparatuses. And then what you said about creating a world of references is exactly that. You know, you start like pulling, you know, Leibniz and computer ontologies and whatnot, and throw it all out there and see how that starts to conform when you're establishing this correlation, you know. And like the methodological problems are so complex that if you start through them in a kind of a, you know, 2-day workshop like this, then you would probably have the whole workshop about the methodological problems. So I kind of didn't focus that much on that. And I think this, like what I'm saying here, is still also like quite tentative and flawed. But I also think that you also have to like start doing something and then you navigate it from there. But yeah, I just think that that is still as problematic as it is. It's still better than what would be the comfortable way, which would be, you know, yeah, Latour is similar, like, you know, actor network theory and like Parliament of Things is similar. So let's just go with Latour because, you know, there's no problematicity. You know, he's an European white guy and we can like cite him like any other author. But then it has this like liberal background in which the whole paradigm in which you're thinking the negotiation between those different agencies and words and perspectives is a big parliament and a kind of you know, sphere of public discourse, while in perspectivism it's completely different. It's about war and predation, and that's like, I think, far more radical and also far more politically relevant in the kind of, you know, planetary situation that we're actually living. So
yeah, you're definitely right there. And actually, if I may be a bit anecdotal here, I had an experience of actually taking part in one of Latour's Parliament of Things back when I was on a summer school with him in 2017 in Tübingen. And it was quite funny because actually there is something narcissistic about that exercise in how you try to force hurricanes and seals and dolphins to speak human language in some kind of common forum. Imagine like some extension of COP26, for example, or any other kind of diplomatic meeting, having a certain ethos and a certain etiquette, which is very similar to that of the meeting of the high-level diplomats. And I'm using this word narcissistic also because at the beginning of Viveiros de Castro's Cannibal Metaphysics, he claims that another name for that book, Cannibal Metaphysics, would be probably anti-Narcissus. And it would be a sort of continuation of Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. And this is a moment that very nicely relates to Bogna's dark forest theory of internet that you have also mentioned. You mentioned that we are kind of colleagues, collaborators. Bogna is a good friend. We have met together in Hong Kong a long time ago, and since then we became sort of like pals, like people that hang out sometimes and have always good conversation, She's now doing great job in Shanghai at the Center for AI and Culture at the New York University there, also with Ben Bratton and Anna Greenspan. But the dark forest theory of internet is, to me, interesting also because at one point, she tries to show us through this metaphor something that can be said about general ontological situation of the human subject in the cosmos. At the beginning of the one chapters of the dark forest theory of the internet essay, she says that this theory of the internet is about the tragedy of communication, about its compulsion, necessity, futility, and risk. Where Mark Fisher wanted to distill the internet's uniqueness, Bogna aims to describe its genericity on a cosmic level. She wants to grasp the brutality of our situation. Communication is a compulsion, and yet it is also the source of conflict. So in this kind of perspective that Bogna offers us, there is there is a hidden critique of the way how platform usership is designed today. It is designed, and it is kind of trivial to say it in 2021, but it's good to say that, I guess, that it is designed in a sort of recursive feedback loop as some kind of echo chamber of the narcissistic individuality, always asking these questions that also Bogna asks in the essay. What should be done? And who am I? How am I feeling? Where is my mind? What's on my mind? These are the questions that Bogna is repeating in that essay. And she even says that there is this kind of grand disjunction in how we approach the cloud space, that on the one hand, platforms give us ability to endlessly fortify certain individual positions in terms of opinions we have, in terms of social communities we engage with. And on the other hand, it also kind of confronts us with some kind of exteriority that is somewhere underground, this whole spectacle of hyper-individuation, or some kind of narcissistic delirium that she describes here. And this kind of anti-narcissistic compulsion that she, and I basically agree with her in that, like that she wants to embark, is basically the same vector that is hidden in perspectivism as it is explained by Viveiros de Castro. Because to me, it seems that this very act of basically stepping into the shoes of the other as the first principle of communicating with the other is radically different from what you also described in relation to Latour and the Parliament of Things. Because that's actually a principle that privileges exchange as the first gesture that you need to have before you even establish any sort of meaningful communicatory link. And when I talk about exchange, there's a hidden economic undertone to it, because platforms are irreducibly economic technologies, and they are interesting in how they multiply possibilities of economic relations, actually. We live in a capitalist society, yes, so that's the reason why most of the platforms are straightforwardly monetizing data, but there can be ways how to think about value attribution within platform economies in a way that transcend this sort of capitalist outlook on value. And I think that what we see, for example, in case of NFT markets, we basically see how people crave for attributing value, but the current sort of political economic environment doesn't give them any tools to do so. So they are left with bad opinions, such as attributing value to 8-bit images. And I guess like there is something about a general social creativity that Amerindian perspectivism articulates through how it basically leads to a certain economy of existence that is based in always taking the perspective of the other as the first principle of making any sort of transaction. These transactions are even sometimes described for that reason as predation, but this kind of predation is basically a way how to enrich both parties in this process. So it's not a kind of predation as domination, but we actually are in a sort of equal exchange. When this exchange is sometimes chemical, biological, and very brutally material, yes.
I saw that I didn't get to read like the comment section here because I'm listening to, you know, what Lucas is saying or I'm speaking, but if people who are commenting want to come on and say something or ask something, I think this is a good time to start multiplying the perspectives.
I was actually going to perhaps call out Adam Louis Klein, but whether he can elaborate a bit on his comment about common word and set of all sets.
Well, yeah, you posed the question of like, so how do we create a common world? It seems like Latour and Viveiros kind of, they ultimately end up in some kind of fragmentation of these different worlds. And then they try and tie it back together with the concept of Gaia, right? So then they try and create some kind of meta set, but it seems kind of ambiguous to me, like where that's coming from or how they're positioned in doing that, because they're taking this kind of scientific concept and then they're sort of ontologizing it in this Deleuzian way or in a way they've chosen. It's sort of a little bit ungrounded in a way, but yeah, I think that fragmentation in Viveiros kind of happens probably because of his insistence on that these are always equivocal, divergent relationships between perspectives, right? So you get sort of an antinomy there between a kind of fragmented universe or some kind of totalizing set. And I was proposing that, you know, instead of thinking of a set that's, let's say, larger than everything else, you can think of a set that's so small in a sense, like a point, that it is everything, right? That it's prior to any unification. And this could be the ground of like a generic universal, even though in itself, in itself, it's kind of without content. You're like, oh, it's just like a point. So it's just everything. What is it? But then somehow you have to develop something from this point, right? From this axiom and start giving it content. And yeah, that requires like a certain way of working through the materials, which seems unclear to me in let's say Gaia or however they're trying to configure that.
Yeah, when you talk about points and sets, like that kind of resembles me some ontological jargon that Badiou, for example, invites into discussion of being, existence. And that's the moment when I think that Badiou also works with this kind of definition of point, which is actually extremely rich, because you define point through the virtualities that basically always make it somehow unique, something quite similar to monad again, in a way how it is always a sort of specific perspectival concentration of the whole universe, and that's or some kind of singularity. And I guess like that's the moment where this talking about points can be actually on a certain level of abstraction, another way how to think about perspectives in this sort of Amerindian ontological situation. But there is also another way how we can lead this conversation, and that is not about, okay, how do we design the set itself, but what will this set contain? I guess like in Latour's ontology, this set that we can call common world, or meta set that we will call common world, is basically a set that posits some finite number of social interactions that can happen in the world. And that's I'm kind of basing this intuition on his book on modes of existence, where he defines, I guess, something like 20 different modes of existence, but nevertheless the number is finite. And maybe it's just a methodological rather than ontological decision that he defines a certain finite number of modes of existence. But nevertheless, I guess like this indicates a certain the way how he closes the set by positing a finite number of specific kinds of entities, and those are these modes of existence. Those are these kinds of ways how things can interact with each other in the world. And the opposite in Viveiros de Castro case is that actually we have agents, not relations in this set. And these agents in the set of Viveiros de Castro's ontology, or his translation of the Amerindian perspectivism, is then basically the set of all perspectives that are available. But these perspectives are always replayed in a unique way, depending on where the apprehending agent is sitting within that whole framework, within that whole ontology. So it still stays on a certain level of abstraction that I guess may be a bit difficult to access, but still I guess that there's the way how we can think about this ontological difference between Latour and Viveiros de Castro in a sort of like para or pseudo set language by looking into what actually those sets would contain in case of both these thinkers. Does it make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it seems like, yeah, what you're pointing out, I hadn't thought of it this way. Yeah, Latour with like a finite set of ontologies, right? Something about that is intrinsically not perspectival, right? Because each ontology or each point, right, should be able to just be everything from itself, right? So from where do you say there's just this like set of ontologies? So that, yeah, it seems like to really think perspectively at a certain point would not be ontological in some sense. I think that it would be to think from, yeah, some kind of generic perspective each time that can never really be encapsulated as an ontology, or simply a set of ontologies within a meta-ontology.
Encore had their hands raised, and Mafe has a question.
Hi. Well, more than a question, I just wanted to share my experience, because I'm specifically exploring this thing in my art practice, and I'm working as a, you know, in a hybrid space of platforms between machines. I develop machines that are sensitive and kind of make evident the subtle dimensions of existence, the world, you know, very from, you know, Hermes and all that. And in this exploration, of course, I have been confronted to how I can integrate all the different perspectives of my own existence, not just to navigate the interaction with this machine that has a different language from me, but also to, and of course the problem of understanding, you know, between each other, but also the position of the other, you know, the other people who comes and interact, or the other beings, because plants and animals can be involved too, that interacts and create in this space of resonance all these echoes and noise, and how to interpret all that residual thing. So I'm for example working into exploring my own symbolic space, integrating my dreams as, or seeing my dreams or spiritual experiences while I'm awake, as different points of perspective, like other instances of myself. And one of the problem, the most hard problem that I confronted right now is exactly that, like how to not develop a mental dissociation, right? between all these expressions of myself and, you know, and even questioning who is my real self. I mean, what at the end gives me the certainty that this person that is talking right now is the real self, you know? So it's a tough thing because I'm really committed to this experience, but I found very, very interesting, and I really wanted to thank you all, that you know, the ones that are presenting in Sepideh, because this matter, you know, if you do the exercise of placing yourself as the experiment, you know, as the subject that is entering this other space of post-human, like more than human, more than my human instance, is a real problem that I don't know if it's easy to answer. You know, how do you dump, how not to become in this space or in this exercise of being my true self and trying to understand my individual self, my uniqueness, and also to address the other in that relationship. How not, you know, to end being a narcissist, for example, you know. So it's a really, really interesting problem what you are talking, but not just theoretically, but in the practice of it is really, it's a very complex thing. So thank you for expressing all these ideas, and that's the thing.
Thanks, Mafe. Our friend Ankur raised his hand and lowered it again. Do you want to speak, Ankur?
Oh, sorry. Like, anybody has to speak, and like maybe because like mine is so disorganized. But I have been thinking, because this is the question. Like for 5 days, 3-4 days, I have been also thinking about, and to her my face, like in interest of practice, I don't know how much forensic architecture's practice goes into it. So forensic architecture, which is in London. So how this alternative perspectivism, but I am more interested in this forging method of forging, FORAGING, forging, rather than, because the problem with whatever Shaum or anything is that we will go to what we already know. Say for instance, a priest who asked a thief that why did you theft the bank? So the thief said there was the only money, but priest meant to say something else. But here the thieves meant to say something else. So what I am thinking about this sudden raptures, random raptures in the thinking. Say I randomly throw a coin and it fell there. So forging also a method which randomly goes, then investigation goes out from that there. Also investigation, not investigation as in terms of practice, but also investigation through which we think, the topology of thinking as well. And this randomness, throwing the coin randomly over a certain plane and then realize. So yeah. Because I was also interested in this idea of like legal justice as well as
I'm not sure I fully understand like what like, yeah, I can tell you like about how I see legal justice being inserted there, you know, because that's like my background and not necessarily very easily transparent in the discussion that's happening here. Like probably the most obvious way in which this is related to that is how much Carl Schmitt appeared, which is a legal theorist, though in his conception of nomos, the usual distinctions that are sort of the frame of legal thought as something distinct from other areas are blurred, because in his conception of nomos is not distinct from physis, so law is not normative as opposed to nature being factual, and also nomos doesn't separate law and politics, though a certain nomos, in as much as it is stabilized, might be able to separate those things, right? So I'm talking about modernity itself, or humanity, as a certain nomos, which was able to establish itself as such for a certain time, through a certain set of repeated political operations, which we might consider as a nomic diagram, which stabilizes a world. Like in Schmidt's Nomos of the Earth, it's always, about this. You want to comment?
Yeah, I want to comment, like, there is a set of legal justice which has its own standard, but how to put alternatives, evidences. Say, for instance, this Australian Aboriginal people made these paintings, which was alternative evidence to their land. Even
can you repeat, because it cut a little bit, just the last part?
Say, for instance, the legal justice system, or this court, which is colonial, and they have one mode of perspective, but I'm more interested in the evidences. What are the alternative forms of evidences to put, and how much art practices are the ruptures to which so yeah, this is what I was saying as an evidence to the legal system, which is we can't change. It is like this. So yeah. And
maybe I'll try to jump in, because I guess that actually this is the moment where it finally clicked to me, how all these things come together in certain artistic practices. When you mentioned forensic architecture, so one of the founding members of forensic architecture is Susan Shupri, who wrote a wonderful book on material witnesses in 2020, published by MIT Press. And in that book, she collects, and not just in the book, her artistic practice is all about that to a certain extent, to think about forms of evidence which are not necessarily human in origin, but rather exploit different properties of natural media. One of them may be ice. Imagine that ice is actually a medium, a wonderful archival medium. It can store data about the past of the atmosphere of the planet, because it literally stores that past atmosphere by bubbles of air being deep underground in the layers of the ice. And then the glaciologists come, they drill the ice core, and they try to figure out how to date those different layers, and to think about, okay, so here we have, for example, an air which is 10,000 years old. The chemical composition or the isotopes in that bubble are so and so, which means that, for example, the levels of the CO2 in the atmosphere of the planet 10,000 years ago were that and that in terms of ppm. Nevertheless, what I'm trying to say is the perspectivism can be again mobilized here as a certain tool to understand the legitimacy of these natural evidences, in the way of actually first advising a certain kind of epistemic approach, where actually we try to, and this may sound a bit like a cliche, but I really want to say that there is something in listening and actually in adopting that perspective, which is outside of oneself to some extent, which helps you actually to find the legitimacy in that natural object having some sort of evidentiary role, because it can be also an object that doesn't have to be that old as ice. It can be an object that can be just several decades old, and it can inscribe in some way, for example, a certain kind of violence done to some community. When we talk about forensic architecture's practice, I guess that's what is primarily their sort of scope of operations in cases such as, for example, when they look on the surface of the Negev desert, and they see patterns of past settlements that were ruined by, for example, forces of Israeli Defense Army. And like there are many examples where they kind of touch on this idea of natural media infrastructure that provides some evidentiary or has some evidentiary qualities. And yeah, so basically the idea is that perspectivism can give a legitimacy to this kind of evidentiary role of objects, and it can have quite, I guess, dramatic legal consequences. After all, back in 19th century, when photographs became legitimate evidence on court, and this is, I'm partly paraphrasing at the moment one of Susan Shupley's project as well, which is called Can the Sun Lie? So back in 19th century, photography was established as a means of evidence on courts, mainly because it was said that it happens based on established rules of how nature behaves, that it's a chemical, that it is a result of a photochemical reaction that is actually independent of the human will. And that's the reason why it can be a legitimate way how to make some kind of evidence. So this is just the way how, again, interpret perspectivism as something that can be helpful in this respect.
I also thought of something more concrete, maybe to draw this relation with evidence, which is like right now in Brazil, there's a big question about the mode of existence of their land, right? The constitution, like the democratic constitution of 1988, which is our current constitution, established that indigenous peoples have a right to their traditionally. And then there's two different interpretations of that, which are being judged currently by the Supreme Brazilian Court. And like the indigenous peoples and the indigenous peoples lawyers and everyone who is in favor of indigenous rights, their interpretation is that let's start the other way around. Like there are enemies, right? The agro-business people and conservatives, etc. Their interpretation is that when they say the land that they occupy traditionally, that's just a time stamp that's in 1988, what were the lands in which that indigenous peoples were like occupying and having the possession of? So that's just like projecting this Western legal framework of what it is to have the possession of a certain space of land, and then establishing a certain time. And then for indigenous people to claim some land, they would have to provide evidence, they would have to demonstrate that they were there and they had the possession of that land at that time. And that obviously is very difficult to do because they are being pushed out of their land in very violent and undocumented ways for many years. And also like that, just to prove that if you accept this, which would be already to get out of the question all of the other 500 years of expropriation that came before that. But anyway, and then the other, the indigenous interpretation is that to inhabit land traditionally actually implies or presupposes a completely different concept of what is a legal relation with land. And that is already not simply a legal problem in the sense that legal theory strictly considered is able to conceive it. It's actually, for me at least, a nomic problem. It's a problem of how law emerges from the earth itself, from the earth as, Schmidt starts his book saying that in the mythic language, the earth is the mother of law. And so that's already a conflict between two completely heterogeneous nomic orientations, completely different ways to relate a form of life and a spatiality and an ecology of other beings and all of that. So, so you have this kind of conflict in which, like, what in this second case, what would be evidence? Like what does the concept of evidence even mean? Because the concept of evidence is part of this operational structure of modern law, in as much as it functions on the separation of the norms, what it is that ought to be, and then you have to determine what the facts are so that you can establish a correspondence. But when you go to the level of nomic difference, then the relation between norms and facts itself is different. Like if you take a perspective framework, what counts as a fact and what counts as a social, cultural, normative element is completely redistributed, you know. So so the legal system just can't, with its own framework, with it, which is like traditionally a modernist constitution, you know, mononaturalist framework, it can't really account for what would count or what would mean evidence in this case. And at the same time, as we are having this platformization process, which, you know, in Bratton's discussion and all that, and also Lukáš's discussion, is sort of pushing for something beyond the modern state, you know, that we might be moving into the planetary and all of that, you know, many different ways to diagram that. But anyway, the privileged level of state sovereignty is questioned. Then it's also a question of how you're going to take this, which from our own perspective appears as the past or the archaic, which is related to these native ways of inhabiting the earth, and also these new nomic procedures that platforms create, that might, you know, you could rearrange and reconnect that after the state, so to speak, or in a context in which the state isn't that important. That could be reconnected in very different ways. Like it could create all different kinds of wiring diagrams that would map out different ways of inhabiting the earth and mobilize, you know, capacities of defending them, like being optimistic. You know, you would also have a lot of ways to do even worse things than what the state does. But, you know, I think what we probably should think about in terms of the future of these things is how to establish, you know, the connections between those different worlds and those different strata of, or those different perspectives, because then they are also like, they are spatialities, they are territories of different types, and they're also producing their perspectives. And so how is this encounter between the perspective of a platform and the perspective of the way a traditional community occupies a certain territory? You know, there's multiple ways in which there's already ways in which this is happening right now. For example, in how some technological platforms are being used to monitor and protect the Amazon, like where they have like devices that are distributed to indigenous inhabitants so that they can act monitoring, you know, invasions and environmental problems, and they can, you know, transmit this information to those platforms. So there's already different ways those different levels and those different worlds are relating, you know, and that could be, you know, much more different from what we can imagine. You know, this is just something very simple, very something that's not hard to understand, but as these things advance, they could be far more complex than that. I think that's like what I think this kind of discussion could help us articulate. Like I really think that in many contexts, it would be really hard to think critically about this stuff from a sort of a modern perspective. Like you just wouldn't be able to pose the right questions and the right problems.
Ben left some comments in the chat. Maybe you can turn on your mic and elaborate a bit.
Does it work?
Like, do you want us to read the comment, or would you mind performing it for the
I'm not sure if it will be any clearer. I've been reading Friedrich Nietzsche recently, and I like the idea. I've always found it confusing on several of the foreign objects talks, especially the inferential ones where they're going on about worlds all the time. It seems to be stuck in people's heads as if the outside world doesn't exist. So if you allow the planet to exist, you can still have different worlds. So the neo-naturalists are stuck in like some sort of neuro-constructivism. But we all know that things come in whether we don't like it or not. He also talks about clairvoyant societies, as in beyond control societies, states, Western states are just working on planning scenarios. Not what is happening, they test them against things. Or say American military policy, their strategy is to function in a way crazy, as if no one knows what they're going to do, but it's still a scenario type thing. So the interesting thing I found about the shamanic thing, it takes you outside of that. It gives you contact with this outsideness. And I'm using the nest bit not to force a binary on inside, outside. It's still not any clearer.
No,
it is clear.
I think it's clear.
I guess, yeah. Because to me, it really seems that there is a vector of actually accepting some kind of outsideness that is the condition of actually being able to engage in any kind of, interactions that allow, that perspectivist ontology allows. So this privileging of the outsideness that I guess would destroy this binary between the interior and the exterior. This kind of privileging of the outsideness leads to finally accepting the mind itself, the reason, the faculties of cognition as also being somehow exterior, or kind of like being exterior in that way that they can be expressed, perhaps not necessarily in eliminative materialist ontology, but nevertheless expressed as physical material events or properties of matter in some way, of, for example, highly complex biological matter such as humans. And that's a sort of surprisingly materialist conclusion of perspectivism, which actually doesn't need some kind of like virtuality of a kind of non-material spirituality or some kind of like cultural realm which is constructed independently of the world of matter. I guess like the matter, So to me, like this is the moment when what you are talking about in relationship to outsideness, in relationship to, for example, the planet, like it makes perfect sense to, for example, understand our agency and our subjectivity as a certain effect or property of that outsideness, which we call the planet, which I don't think is the same position as Neirath's, but still an interesting position to venture further into.
Yeah, and I don't know how to answer the other bit. I'm interested in the concept of desertion. It doesn't get rid of the idea of war, ecocide, genocide, but it allows us to step outside of this modern law, which is actually quite parochial. It's very Western, very Roman based. And perhaps it will allow us to then focus on what Z was saying earlier about paying attention to the shame. That was such a relevant point you made there, without trying to, the danger of reappropriating these people's thoughts. But I'm lost now, my head's aching because it's been so good. It's really made my head hurt in a good way. It's been one of the best, foreign objects things.
Wow,
yeah, I'm too incoherent to say anything else.
No, thanks so much. I think those are very important, like, concerns. Like, only, I mean, I'm not sure I know exactly what to say about desertion, but I think the point about, you know, avoiding the friend-enemy distinction is something that I would like to keep trying to elaborate precisely to, you know, because I think this process that I was talking about, where, you know, in anthropology, you have to reconstruct, like, you know, like the way Viveiros is sort of reconstructing, like, to put it in a very simplified way, like reconstructing those Amerindian ontologies through, among other things, certain Deleuzian conceptual apparatus. Like, I'm here, like, bringing that into, like, legal problems through this Schmittian apparatus, which is what I have that's somehow close, but then there's stuff that you see that starts to conflict, and you find ways to switch that around. And sometimes it's like putting a little bit of Deleuze into the Schmitt to make it look a bit more like the Viveirian reconstruction of Amerindian perspectivism. So in this case of friend enemy, like, there's a whole discussion which I didn't go into here about the immanence of the enemy and how this whole relation, you know, there's a whole part of this that is not only how animals might be, you know, animals are people for themselves, but also there's an indistinction between, like, people who are, like, humans who are from other peoples, you know, from other communities, other, like, social political communities. They also aren't necessarily human, you know. Usually humans is just like our group, and you, many times the name of the group is just we the humans or something of this sort in their own language, right? So this is a very Schmittian theme, but then the relation between the friend and enemy, which becomes a relation between who is counted as human and who isn't a relation of exteriority with a border, but is actually this like, I imagine, like, two cones which are you know, like, traversing each other. You know, you're defining your perspective always through this enemy in this relation, which is at once relation of seeing and being seen, and thus of, like, cognition and thought, and is also a relation of war and of violence and of predation. Also, like, the idea of anthropophagy or cannibalism, you know, the idea that you're relating to this, you're internalizing this other, not by mind, by, you know, putting the idea of the other inside your mind, but you're actually also consuming the other's body, so that the other's body is within your is, you know, mixed with your own body, your own substance. So I think this sort of produces this thing that you're calling the outsiderness, right? Because then you're not either epistemically or politically in a solipsistic position. You know, you're always in this correlation. You're constituted in those multiple instances in which you correlate to other perspectival centers. And yeah, and that's like the Leibnizian thing, but it's also different. And then, like, I really wish they would elaborate, like, on the similarities and differences between, like, Amerindian perspectivism and, like, Leibnizian, because, you know, like, Deborah Danowski, who is Viveiros' wife, is a Leibnizian philosophy, like a philosophy professor who specializes in Leibniz. So I really wish they would, like, you know, actually do the whole, like, comparison, which I think would unpack a lot of interesting stuff as well. Maybe someday they're going to do that. I don't know.
Can I have a very brief comment on this friend-enemy dynamics? Because to me, it also seems that there's a possibility of turning the Schmittian duality of friend and enemy into kind of pseudo-Foucaultian perspective, where actually everyone is by default an enemy. And this kind of situation is then a situation where actually to establish any kind of friendship, you first need to declare something like a handshake protocol, through which actually you can sort of engage in an exchange that is equal and mutual. I'm calling it pseudo-Foucaultian just because, to me, one of the intuitions that I take from Foucault, which usually are not taken for granted, is that to Foucault, actually power is a necessary part of social relations. And it's not just something that sometimes happens, that people are in the position of power, but that power is something that is informal and exists in any kind of network or any kind of community. And the way how to deal with power is not to isolate it, but by means of finding protocols of making consent and engaging in the relationship based on finding ways how to make consent, on creating certain power structures temporarily. And to me, that's the moment when then also we can think a bit more perhaps pragmatically and realistically about how to especially how to exist in a society which is full of different communities or full of different perspectives. And that's by means of declaring these handshake protocols as something that can be sort of like a banner put in front of the doors of every house, of every community, of every individuality, as a way how to, perhaps it's a bit idealistic, but nevertheless, I just wanted to throw it on the table because to me, it's a good way how to find our very hopeful situation in something that sounds very horrible at first, and that's the idea that everyone is by default an enemy.
There's also like an idea that a friend is developing, I think, in his work. Like I haven't read, he's just not long ago started his PhD in the New School, and he's sort of like reading Hobbes, like Hobbesian political theory, and he's reading that through Viveiros and Marilyn Strathern, but not so much in terms of perspectivism, but in terms of kinship. So in terms of how society is constituted, and also, I guess, the relation between kinship and exchange, which Lukáš is also like bringing into the discussion. So, I think you can like, there's this also Viveiros' idea of virtual kinship that certain Amazonian societies would have this, like, could be interpreted with this delusion concept of virtuality as a way to explain, someone can be virtually related to you, and then you have this this relation with the people with whom you don't have social relation, as working in the register of becoming. I guess it's something like this is something that I wish I still want to actually get into as well, to see how it would connect to this part about perspectivism and nomos and all that, because I think if you combine that with the Schmittian legal problematic, it's probably going to enrich this toolbox that we're starting to construct here with the part about perspectives and nature and culture. And I think it's a different, it's another side of the same, actually, the same problematic.
Mehra?
Yes, just mentioning specifically Foucault in this book, the psychiatric power. So one point that is very interesting for me and as an association is that, it's not the same to be in this world to be a crazy man than a crazy woman, right? It's a very different thing. So one thing is that I found fascinating is how we all, our first enemy is ourselves, like in this frame of thought. Because women since ever has been, we have been castrated in our own nature, like that has to be silenced. And there is an analogy with the indigenous, that their tongues were cut in some way, and that is like a metaphor of how their entire cosmogony, language, everything was also cut, is bad, so you have to hate yourself. The first thing that to create that separation from nature was your language, or ergo your world, any expression of it is wrong, is bad, so it has to be killed, it has to be canceled and eliminated. And from there, if you see that, I don't have like a proposition to say right now, but I'm just seeing the strong connection between that idea from Foucault about how not just the body is like a political object, but the mind is a very important political object, and how the limits and the constraints of the mind becomes like what define us right now and what will come to define us in the future. How can we speak about freedom, if we have this such constraints about the how can we come to be, in this world? So well, again, it's a fascinating thing what you're talking about, and I just wanted to make that association between these three things that I think are very deeply related.
You wanted to, like, I was curious about like you were telling us about practical experiences of some kind of shamanistic or post-humanistic transformation. Do you want to, like, I don't know, give an example of that or something like that? That sounded like I was just curious about like the context, I guess, or the concrete
yes,
mode.
sure. So I started to create these machines that are physical, like physics, talking about like scientific physics, artifacts that in some way resonate and interact with us in the electromagnetic field. So let's say that my whole proposition has been that we are not just a mind and a body and a spirit, but all these residual space that we cannot, in quotations, perceive through our senses or reach through our reason is there and exists. So, the space is constituted by more than the things that we can know and reach, right? So this is, of course, like an empiric experiment. I'm not a scientist, I'm an artist. And in the development of that work, of course, I have become, this is like an extension of my subtle body, right? It's like metaphorically, like if I took my own nervous system and created this technological artifact outside of me in order to be able to perceive these other parts of the existence or reality that I cannot perceive through my human senses, right? So in that process, I have been becoming a hybrid being because, of course, at the moment that I have to integrate the experience of this machine, and the machine integrates my experience as a human, so appears this third object or thing that has these two natures now, and it has been, of course, a pretty intense experiment. And the machines as an art, let's say, installation is getting into places people that want to explore and experience that too, because of course it becomes like a plural body, right? Like the public, the people who interact with the machine is interacting with me, and it becomes a more communal experience that I kind of associate with the experience of the shaman and the tribe, in the senses of accessing these different dimensions of reality together, right? And all that. So in this practice, I have been, for example, invited to Wasta, South Dakota, and I have an experience with the Lakota people and different spiritual exchanges. Like, for example, I was in different rituals with them, and I was able to experience this a very different world and a very different approach to reality than the reality that I live and that I grew up, right, as a human being. So the integration of that experience, as well as the integration of other instances of myself as a woman, for example, my intuition, my dreams, my psychic, let's say, aspects, right, that are, that I'm exploring just in a freedom of not like judging if it's good or bad, if it's true or not. I'm just letting myself be in all that spaces, and that is, of course, bringing me back a lot of content and meaning and material to work with, but also as a human being, a lot of problems, because it becomes an existential complication. How can I be myself? How can I be a complete, in quotation, self, and reinsert myself into a society that is always asking for my agency? What is your agency to say that you can do this, that you actually can exist this way? So that's why I'm so excited about this conversation, because it's, of course, resonates like 200% with my work, and it's giving me so much frame, to organize my experience and think and reflect about it, because it's not the same, to be in the thing, that to be able to abstract from that and think about that. So that is, now I'm having a lot of structure, let's say.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm really glad it's helpful. And also I think your example is quite interesting in terms precisely of, like, this relation that we were discussing about, shamanism as this usage of certain technologies to alter what is counting as your body, that device that you created to affect those kind of subtle aspects of embodiment. I think is quite compatible with this. And also I think it made me think of something that I think is important for me, at least, which is that often, like, we take this necessary caution that we have been discussing since the beginning about, how you can't just assume that you're going to look at or read about a different cosmology and you're just going to snap into it or like copy it into your system, or that you're going to go to a ritual and go to like drink ayahuasca once and you're going to become an indigenous shaman and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think it's also wrong to simply assume a complete difference, and transcendence and inaccessibility of that kind of stuff. I think that's another way to picture non-Western cosmologies as archaic, traditional, static ways of being. Like, those people were always like conditioned to do the same thing for no reason. Like, those are also, alive and intellectually exploring people who are doing various stuff and, making it up as they go along and trying things and seeing what happens, and nothing about modernity or something like that has the power to make a human being completely disconnected. Those are always like relative differences, I think. So you're always going to have to reconstruct your own kind of rituals or your own kind of processes, but I also think that it's also a kind of an excuse and a comfort zone to think that, you know, this is just this kind of thing is just not for me because I'm a modern, and so I'm going to just like continue being a modern. You know, you can't just think you're going to become non-modern, but you can't also just be completely at peace with being modern. That's not an option either. So I think like, and not only because you have like an ethical injunction to become non-modern, but because, you know, this whole procedure, there's this whole process that's transforming the way our worlds are made and remade, including technology, platformization, and all that, that's tearing apart the fabric of just being modern. So you're going to, you know, you have to make a new configuration, and for that, any kind of materials that you can use are available. You know, you're going to have to make your own reconstruction and think out of them. But I don't think it's you know, inaccessible to be or not a valid option to be you know, in dialogue and even in a kind of immanent dialogue with those things, but immanent in this correlational immanence kind of regime that we are discussing, right? There's also like I was seeing that there was like a comment by Paige from the beginning that I think was quite interesting, and Cássia just pasted it. That Paige Emery commented that spiderweb is also considered as an extended phenotype. So maybe the schema is related to the idea of extended phenotype. This is the kind of thing that Deleuze uses because he's like randomly reading some biology books, and then he just brings something into his philosophical discourse without any kind of context or explanation. But I think it's such a productive, you know, procedure that he's doing. And I think that's what he was thinking about. And I think he's kind of saying that this idea of the extended phenotype is valid not only for the spider web, but for everything that the lion does, or for anything that any animal does. And I think what he's doing in a way by doing that is a sort of response. Of course, he's not thinking of this, but I'm framing this as a sort of response to the discussion we were having with Salarzianism since the last time, in terms of when you say that like the animal can't be an actor because the animal just follows patterns. So he just has a wiring diagram, which is kind of a monolithic thing. It doesn't have the property that our rule following has, which is kind of creating a back and forth between different rhythms of different types of patterns, which one becomes recursive upon the other, and then that creates, you know, what we call agency. You know, I think in a way what Deleuze is trying to show there is that the relation between the coding that is in the genotype, you know, the really like coded part of the animal species, and this phenotypical part, which is also relation with the environment, that is also bifurcated, and there is also a kind of back and forth between two things there. I think in a way what he's trying to do that is also like to show what he calls, you know, the double bind or the double articulation that is happening between a form of content and a form of expression on the animal level, you know, I think. I think maybe we could, like, if anyone has like final comments, like Lukáš or Adam or anyone, we could like try to wrap it up. I think people are probably going to be tired at this point.
Well, I was thinking a bit about how to express these attitudes towards relativity of beliefs towards incommensurability or commensurability of different belief systems. But I actually didn't form any sort of consistent opinion on it on the go. I just started skimming through my old notes from reading Davidson's on the very idea of conceptual scheme, which is actually an attack of the relativism on the level of belief systems. But that would be too much for this night hour to expect of me or of anyone.
Before we wrap it up, I want to remind you all that in the beginning of December, the 4th and the 11th, we are going to have another study group with Ray Garcia. I'll just paste the link for the event here, and you're all invited to show up.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. It was really a big opportunity. Like, I feel like I've developed a lot of the stuff that I brought here to new places. Thanks everyone for coming and participating. Really happy about it. And also, like, probably like we were discussing with Sepideh and all that, we are probably going to do some kind of reading group and think about maybe another, because there was an initial plan for this workshop, which would be, as Lukáš knows, because he was already invited for the initial plan, which was perspectivism and engineering. And then we would discuss other texts, you know, like models and examples by Viveiros, and try to establish the connections and contrast between that and the kind of neo-rationalist conception and project of engineering. So possibly we might reconstruct that version of maybe for next year. So like if you're interested, we can keep in touch. Like also any kind of thoughts, if you're watching this afterwards or anything like that, and you wanna make comments or discuss or anything, I'm always available for this kind of thing when it's, you know, something that I'm trying to research. So please feel free to contact me or anything like that. Yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks.